The summer of 1812 carried a strange stillness across the vast plains of Eastern Europe, a quiet that seemed to tremble beneath the footsteps of an army the world had never seen before. More than 500,000 men, French, Italian, German, Dutch, Polish, Swiss, and countless others, moved like a living tide under the banner of a single man, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, the so-called Master of Europe, a commander who had never failed in a campaign of his choosing. To his soldiers he was the embodiment of victory, the man whose presence alone could turn fear into fire and defeat into triumph. But as the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River in June, leaving behind the familiar territories of the Empire and stepping into the immeasurable vastness of Russia, an invisible weight pressed upon them. They were entering not merely another nation, but an entirely different world, one larger than their maps, harsher than their memories, and older than their understanding of war. Russia was a land where distance became a weapon, time itself turned hostile, and nature could strike with as much precision as any army. Napoleon had expected a single decisive battle, a dramatic clash, one worthy of the emperor's legend, a battle he would win, forcing the Tsar to kneel and sign a treaty. But instead of confronting him, the Russians withdrew deeper and deeper into their own territory. They offered nothing, no grand engagement, no city prepared for heroic defense, no stand on a hill to mark where the fate of nations would be decided. They simply retreated, burning everything behind them: villages, crops, grain stores, wells, barns, bridges. Entire districts were turned into barren ash before the French could reach them. French soldiers marched forward with the excitement of glory, only to find empty fields and suffocating smoke. "They leave nothing," some whispered. "Absolutely nothing." The scorched earth spread like a curse, and soon it became clear. Napoleon had not marched into Russia to fight an army. He had marched into a trap. A slow, patient trap set by men who understood the nature of their homeland better than any strategist in Paris. The heat of the summer was oppressive. Dust filled the air like powdered stone. Horses collapsed along the roads, ribs showing, tongues dry and swollen. Men crawled toward filthy streams, drinking whatever they could find. Water polluted by dead animals, stagnant pools alive with insects, even the urine of horses. Many grew sick, many died. Still the column pressed forward. Napoleon, confident in his genius, believed the Russians would sooner or later turn and defend Moscow. He thought the old capital was sacred and that its defense was inevitable. So the army pushed deeper, farther from supplies, farther from friendly territory, and farther into the heart of a country that refused to bend. Behind them, the line of communication stretched thin as silk. Garrisons were scattered at Smolensk, Vitebsk, and Minsk. Reserve corps marched to reinforce a front that seemed to stretch into infinity. As the Grande Armée advanced, the Russians continued their measured withdrawal with a discipline that surprised even their own officers. The columns moved like a breathing organism, artillery protected by cavalry, infantry shielding the vulnerable guns, scouts constantly watching for flanking attempts. Weather-beaten soldiers loosened their tunics in the choking heat. Sweat fell like rain into the dust. Yet they held firm in their retreat, trusting their commanders and trusting their land. Some officers wrote that they felt a strange inevitability settling upon them. The French were brave and skilled. Nobody doubted that. But it felt as if the land itself, the forests, the rivers, the endless plains, were slowly aligning against the invaders. Among the retreating Russians was an officer named Nadezhda Durova, one of the few women to fight in the Russian cavalry. She wrote that she felt no despair during the long withdrawal. Instead, she believed that fate was guiding the French deeper, deeper into a land that would devour them. The morale of the Russian army rose sharply when General Mikhail Kutuzov took command. A rotund old soldier with a scarred face and a slow gait, he was no Napoleon in appearance, but the soldiers felt something familiar in him, something Russian, something grounded. He promised no miracles, only patience, endurance, and the wisdom to fight on their own terms, not Napoleon's. He had no illusions about the French emperor. Napoleon was a genius, yes, but he was also arrogant, impulsive, and far from home. With Kutuzov at the helm, the plan became simple. Pull Napoleon deeper, avoid a final battle until the moment was right, stretch the French thin, and let hunger, exhaustion, and distance do the killing. Russia's reserves would gather, the people's resistance would grow, Cossack riders, wild and fearless, would tear at the edges of the French column like wolves at a wounded stag. And so the French marched, past empty villages whose doors banged open in the wind, past orchards cut down to stumps, past wells filled with rotting carcasses so no Frenchman could drink, past forests where Cossacks watched from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Even as Napoleon's army suffered, they pushed forward, driven by discipline, faith, and the promise of an end to their misery. Soldiers wrote home about marching through smoke-filled forests, sleeping without bread, eating nothing but strips of half-cooked meat. They complained of Russians who refused battle, of marching day after day without firing a shot, of chasing ghosts across burning fields. Still, Napoleon believed the decisive clash was coming. Moscow was ahead, and surely the Russians would defend Moscow. By late August, the first signs appeared. Kutuzov had positioned the Russian army near Borodino, and fortifications were rising from the earth like teeth. A redoubt at Shevardino, hastily built but fiercely defended, became the first real blood-soaked symbol of what was coming. French forces attacked it with overwhelming numbers, but the defenders fought like cornered beasts. The redoubt changed hands in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Night fell, and still men screamed in the darkness. When the Russians finally withdrew, the hill was covered in torn bodies, thousands of them, lit only by the distant glow of burning villages. And yet, this was only the prelude, only the opening chord of a symphony of suffering. Because ahead lay the village of Borodino, and there, on a rising slope of land crowned by earthworks and artillery, the Russians prepared to make their stand. Napoleon had finally been given what he wanted, one colossal battle. But what neither side yet understood was that the Battle of Borodino would not be a triumph. It would not be a decisive victory. It would be something far darker. It would be a slaughter, a storm of fire and iron so terrible that even seasoned officers would later say they could not describe it without their hands trembling. The sun was rising on the morning of September 7, 1812, and the fields of Borodino were about to become the crucible in which the fate of an empire would be forged. And so begins the true descent, into blood, into fire, into one of the most brutal battles Europe had ever seen. The dawn that broke over Borodino on September 7, 1812, was unlike any other dawn the Grande Armée had seen in months. It was quiet, eerily, unnaturally quiet. No burning villages smoldered nearby. No Cossack scouts darted through the forest, no columns of smoke twisted up from the horizon. Only mist moved across the Russian earth, and within that mist lay 250,000 men waiting for one command. Waiting for the moment when the silence would shatter and the earth would tremble under the weight of war. Napoleon had awakened before sunrise. He had not slept well. His stomach was burning. Illness clung to him like a second cloak. Yet even weakened, his presence carried a gravity that made generals straighten their backs and soldiers cling to belief. They expected him to win, not because of strategy or numbers, but because he was Napoleon. To the French, he was destiny made flesh. And so, when he dictated his proclamation to the troops, his voice, though strained, did not waver. "Soldiers," he said, "here is the battle you have long desired." Words meant to ignite hope. Words meant to give meaning to the hunger, the exhaustion, the endless march. He promised supplies, warmth, rest, and a swift return home. He promised that one final victory here, on this Russian field, would end the campaign. But to thousands of weary men, these promises drifted across the lines like fading embers. Some never heard the speech at all. Others listened with hollow eyes, too tired to believe in anything but survival. And many thought only of the battle itself, the one they had marched toward for months. A battle they sensed would claim more than victory. It would claim souls. On the Russian side, there was no fiery speech, no grand proclamation. The night before, Kutuzov had ordered the sacred icon of the Virgin Mary, taken from Smolensk, to be carried before the troops. Priests chanted in ancient tones. Soldiers, peasants, nobles, militiamen fell to their knees in the mud, crossing themselves over and over. It was not courage that filled the Russian lines that night. It was something deeper, something older, a quiet acceptance that this land, their land, must not fall, not to Napoleon, not to anyone. As the mist thinned and the first shafts of light pierced the sky, the battlefield revealed itself. Rolling fields torn by trenches, hills shaped into redoubts, arrow-shaped fortifications known as flèches, streams carving natural obstacles. And between all these, rows of Russian infantry packed so tightly that there were as many as 16 men per meter of defensive line. They were sardines in uniforms, men who knew perfectly well they would be hit by cannonballs long before they ever saw a French soldier. Napoleon's plan was simple, inspired by the logic that had won him so many victories. Fix the Russian right, smash the Russian left, break the center, drive wedges into the line until it collapsed into panic. But Borodino was not Austerlitz. The Russians were not the same army he had shattered before. Time, exhaustion, and the scorched earth had changed everything. At exactly 6 in the morning, the signal cannon of the Imperial Guard roared across the fields. It echoed like the voice of fate itself. One moment, silence. The next, the entire world erupted into thunder. Hundreds of French guns unleashed a storm of iron that crashed into the Russian lines. The ground shook. Horses reared in terror. Trees splintered and fell. The first shells hit the flèches, sending geysers of earth and bodies into the air. The Russians did not break. They simply stepped forward to fill the gaps left by the dead. French infantry advanced in massive columns, bayonets glinting in the rising sun. It was slow, suffocating work. Smoke swallowed them whole. Officers shouted orders lost in the overwhelming roar of artillery. Men stumbled over the wounded. Muskets fired blindly into the haze. The Russians answered with their own guns, more numerous and better positioned. Their cannonballs ripped through the tight French formations, carving bloody corridors through men who continued forward because there was no other direction to go. A lieutenant wrote later that he could not hear musket fire for hours. The cannonade drowned everything, roaring so loudly that even officers screamed just to be heard by men standing beside them. One might think, he said, that the sky itself was on fire. The flèches, those small, crude earthworks, became scenes of unimaginable horror. The French took them once. Then the Russians counterattacked and took them back. Then the French stormed forward again. Each time the ground became more saturated with blood, muskets jammed with powder residue, bayonets bent or broke, men used rifle butts, fists, teeth, anything that could kill. Marshal Davout, one of Napoleon's greatest field commanders, was thrown off his horse by an exploding shell and knocked unconscious. Entire brigades reformed only to be shattered again minutes later. Russian generals were cut down at their posts. Officers tore at their hair and screamed for order, but there was none. Borodino had swallowed order whole. By mid-morning, the battlefield had become a churning cauldron where formations dissolved into survival instincts. Men fired from behind piles of corpses because the dead offered better cover than any trench. Horses collapsed from exhaustion or terror, crushing the men underneath. Surgeons set up makeshift stations only to be overrun by waves of wounded who begged for water, morphine, or death. And still, Napoleon hesitated. His imperial guard, the undefeated, unbroken elite, stood waiting behind him, 10,000 strong. They were the hammer he had always used to finish a battle. Their charge could have shattered the Russian center, but he refused to send them. He was ill, cautious, afraid of risking the one unit he believed he could not replace. So the slaughter continued, without breakthrough, without decision, without mercy. By noon, the flèches finally fell for the last time. Their defenders lay in tangled heaps of limbs and shattered rifles. The southern Russian flank had been torn open. General Bagration, bleeding heavily from a leg wound that would later kill him, had been carried from the field, his soldiers screaming and refusing to believe their little father was gone. The Grande Redoubt, an immense fortress of earth and artillery, now stood exposed. French cavalry charged again and again through a swampy ravine that swallowed horses whole. Men fought knee-deep in mud as cannonballs turned the water crimson. When the French finally stormed the redoubt in mid-afternoon, they climbed over mountains of corpses. Men and horses mixed together, armor smashed into bone, helmets split in half like eggshells. Survivors wrote that they stumbled through a landscape that felt like the end of the world. And still Napoleon did not move. Still he held back the guard. Still he waited. By evening, both armies were shadows of themselves. Units that had marched into battle with 3,000 men stumbled out with barely 300. Officers could not recognize their own regiments. The dead lay in grotesque poses across the fields, arms reaching upward, mouths frozen in silent screams, bodies headless or limbless or burned until they were nothing but charred silhouettes. The sun set over Borodino red as blood. There was no music, no victory cry, no sense of triumph. The French held the field, but the Russians had not broken. They had simply fallen back. And during the night, Kutuzov made the decision: retreat toward Moscow, preserve the army, live to fight another day. Napoleon, exhausted and sick, did not pursue. And so, the Battle of Borodino, one of the bloodiest one-day engagements in European history, ended not with a conclusion, but with a silence heavier than defeat. The next morning, the French marched toward Moscow, and the Russians burned what remained in their wake. Soon, the greatest city of Russia would rise in flames, and Napoleon would enter a capital that held no triumph, only smoke, ghosts, and the beginning of the end. When the Grande Armée approached Moscow in mid-September, the soldiers felt a strange pulse of anticipation moving through their ranks. For months they had marched through burning villages, through forests stripped bare, through empty towns echoing with nothing but wind and distant hoofbeats. But now, rising on the horizon like a shimmering mirage, stood the golden domes and ancient white walls of the city that had lived in their imaginations for generations. Moscow, the heart of old Russia, the symbol of its spirit, the jewel of the empire. Many French soldiers believed that reaching Moscow meant the end of the war. They imagined warm houses instead of wet bivouacs, bread instead of horse meat, wine instead of muddy water scooped from a ditch. They imagined winter quarters, comfort, women, music, and the long-awaited peace treaty. Some even fantasized about the triumphant parade they would one day tell their children about. The march into Moscow would not be invasion, it would be triumph. But as they neared the city, something felt wrong. The roads were clogged not with defenders, but with refugees. Thousands of wagons creaked forward, filled with wounded soldiers, crying children, elderly peasants clutching icons to their chests. The air carried no smell of cooking fires, only the acrid scent of stress, sweat, and fear. Russian soldiers trudged alongside civilians, disordered, exhausted, looting as they withdrew. This was not the defiant stand Napoleon had envisioned. Inside Moscow, the panic was absolute. Families rushed to pack whatever they could: silverware, icons, heirlooms, sacks of grain, blankets, livestock, piling them into carts so overloaded that oxen collapsed in the streets. Church bells rang without rhythm, summoning the faithful to pray one last time before abandoning their holy city. In the Kremlin, officials debated madness. Some screamed for a final stand, others insisted that Moscow must be sacrificed, just like Smolensk. It was Kutuzov, old and weary, who finally delivered the verdict. The city could not be defended. The army was too weak, too battered from Borodino, too short on ammunition and food. A final stand would destroy the last Russian army, and with it, the empire. So Moscow would be left to the French. The shock was like ice running through the veins of every Russian. The holy city abandoned, the ancient capital handed to the enemy. It felt like the end of the world. A lieutenant wrote that walking through the evacuating city was like stepping inside a nightmare. Every face pale, every voice trembling, every street choked with sorrow. Mothers cried as they led children away from homes their families had lived in for centuries. Monks carried relics out of cathedrals, bowing their heads as they passed icons blackened by candle smoke. And through all this chaos, a darker plan took root. Governor Rostopchin, desperate to deny the French any shelter or supplies, ensured that the city's fire brigades, over 2,000 men with 96 pumps, left Moscow along with the refugees. He also gave secret orders to the chief of police. When the French entered, Moscow must burn. And so, when Napoleon's vanguard marched through the city gates on September 14th, they found Moscow strangely silent. No crowds, no cheering, no trembling officials waiting to surrender. Only the echo of their own boots and the hollow rattle of abandoned shutters slamming in the wind. Sergeant Bourgogne later wrote that entering Moscow felt like stepping into a dream. The streets were empty, the vast mansions stood open, untouched. Carpets still lay on the floors, food still sat on tables. But no one was there. It was a ghost city. Napoleon entered the Kremlin expecting a deputation from the Tsar, expecting peace talks, expecting the end. Instead, he found silence. And as night fell, that silence cracked open. Small fires began to appear across the city. At first, French officers assumed drunken soldiers had caused them. But soon the flames multiplied, faster than any accidental blaze. Winds picked up and carried burning embers from roof to roof, street to street. Suddenly the French realized the truth. The fires were no accident. Arsonists were caught with torches and tinder. Some were executed on the spot. But it didn't matter. The fire was alive now, alive and hungry. By midnight, an inferno raged across the Kitai-Gorod district. Towers of flame rose into the sky, painting the darkness red. Sparks blew past the Kremlin walls like fiery snowflakes. Entire neighborhoods exploded into walls of heat. French soldiers tried to form bucket brigades, but without pumps, without order, without enough water, the city was doomed. The flames roared louder than cannons. Roofs collapsed in showers of sparks. Horses screamed as they burned alive in stables. Churches, their golden domes reflecting the fire, burst open as centuries-old wooden beams ignited. The smoke grew so thick that men vomited in the streets, staggering blindly through ash and embers. Napoleon, choking on the fumes, was forced to flee the Kremlin and take refuge in a distant palace. The night sky glowed orange for miles, turning the countryside into a surreal mirror of hell. When rain finally arrived days later, the city lay in ruins. 73% of churches destroyed, nearly a third of homes gone, countless treasures reduced to ash. And in the ashes, something darker twisted inside the hearts of the French soldiers. They had expected comfort. Instead, they found death. Hunger, already sharp, became unbearable. Water was scarce. Tempers snapped. French troops began looting with madness, ripping gold from churches, smashing furniture for firewood, killing civilians who resisted. Women were dragged into alleys. Bodies lay in streets, frozen in positions of terror. A Bavarian soldier wrote that he saw men fight each other like animals over scraps of bread. But Moscow offered none of the supplies Napoleon had promised. It was a dead city, a trap, and the longer the French stayed, the weaker they became. Napoleon sent letter after letter to Tsar Alexander begging for peace. He sent envoys, he wrote personally, he pleaded, but the Tsar did not answer, not once. In St. Petersburg, Alexander muttered a single sentence to his advisors: "As long as Napoleon is in Moscow, I will sign nothing." So the French emperor waited, and waited, and waited. But Russia was not waiting. Kutuzov had rebuilt his army. Reinforcements gathered. New troops marched from the Baltic, from Ukraine, from the Urals. Partisans stalked French foraging parties. Cossacks haunted the countryside like spirits of vengeance. Napoleon's position worsened every day. And then, on October 13th, the first snowflakes began to fall. Not many. Just a whisper of what was coming. But for the Grande Armée, those flakes marked the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare. A nightmare of ice, starvation, endless marches, and death by the tens of thousands. The retreat was coming, and it would be worse than anything the French had endured so far. Worse than Borodino. Worse than the fires of Moscow. Worse than hunger. Worse than exhaustion. Worse than fear. It would be a march into the heart of winter, a march into despair, a march that would shatter an empire, and there would be no turning back. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat from Moscow, the air was strangely still. The snow the soldiers had seen a few days earlier had melted into patches of mud, but everyone knew, every man, every officer, every camp follower, that this was only the beginning. Winter had whispered its warning. Soon it would scream. Before dawn on October 19th, the remnants of the Grande Armée began to roll out of the ruined city in a long, disjointed procession. There was no triumphant marching band, no banners snapping proudly in the wind. Only the creaking of thousands of overloaded wagons, the groans of wounded men being carried on makeshift stretchers, and the hollow clatter of horseshoes on frozen cobblestone. But most haunting of all was the silence. Moscow did not bid them farewell. No angry crowds, no defenders throwing stones, no priests chanting curses from the steps of a cathedral. The dead city simply watched them leave, quiet and burned, its blackened ruins rising behind them like a judgment they would carry for the rest of their lives. The columns stretched for kilometers. Soldiers walked with blank eyes, clutching loaves of stolen bread or dragging plunder behind them. Bags of coins, paintings ripped from aristocratic walls, silver icons, furs, books, clocks, anything they thought might be useful or valuable. Some pushed wheelbarrows, others dragged sledges over bare earth in the naive hope that the snow would return soon enough to ease the burden. Napoleon rode near the front, thinking about Smolensk, about Minsk, about the possibility, faint and fading, of holding the army together. His pride would not allow him to admit what many already knew, that the retreat from Moscow would not be a march. It would be a collapse. Behind him on the roads, the scene looked almost biblical. Hundreds of French residents of Moscow marched with the army, desperate not to be left behind in a country now burning with hatred. Russian nobles who had cooperated with the French fled as well, their carriages stuffed with possessions they would later abandon on the roadside. Peasants watched from the edge of forests as the invaders stumbled by. The eyes of these villagers held no mercy. Many had lost everything. Farms burned, livestock slaughtered, relatives murdered or starved. They whispered among themselves, waiting for Cossack patrols to swoop in behind the retreating army like wolves closing in on wounded prey. But the Grande Armée's greatest enemy was not yet the Russians, it was the cold. At first the weather was merely unpleasant, biting winds, snows that melted and refroze into patches of slippery mud, but the temperature dropped a little more each day, slowly draining the strength of horses and men. The nights grew darker, fires were harder to light, boots stiffened into boards, fingers cracked and bled. And always, somewhere beyond the hills, always out of sight, always waiting, the Cossacks hovered. They appeared like ghosts, sometimes just a single rider silhouetted against the horizon, sometimes entire swarms of them sweeping down with terrifying speed. They seldom fought in formal battles. Instead, they struck when the French least expected it, at night, at river crossings, at narrow paths between woods. They swept away stragglers, plundered wagons, cut down foragers, and vanished before the French could react. French officers cursed them, soldiers feared them, but the Russian people admired them as avengers. Still, the worst was ahead. When the army reached the battlefield of Borodino, it was as though time had frozen in the most grotesque way possible. Thousands of corpses still lay on the ground, stiffened in the positions in which they had died. Wolves tore at them without fear. Ravens perched on broken cannons and plucked at exposed rib cages. The wind carried the sickening smell of decay. Some of the wounded still lived. They crawled toward the marching column, begging for help in voices so hoarse and faint that many soldiers mistook them for whispers of wind. But the wagons were full. There was no room for them. No strength to carry them. No mercy left. A few were taken aboard. Many were left behind to die. The horror of Borodino shattered something deep inside the men. They stopped talking, stopped singing, even stopped complaining. They marched in a trance, each step a tiny rebellion against the cold that clawed at their bones. As the army pulled away from Borodino, Kutuzov's forces finally caught up. Miloradovich, bold and eager, saw the enemy stretched thin across miles of road. He begged Kutuzov to allow him to attack, to cut the French rear off completely, to crush Davout's corps and possibly turn the entire retreat into a massacre. Kutuzov hesitated. Again, the Russian commander was cautious. Too cautious, some said. He believed that hunger, cold, and exhaustion were stronger allies than any general. Why risk a bloody engagement when the French were already dying by the thousands with every passing night? But Miloradovich pushed ahead anyway. Near Vyazma, his forces finally pounced. Cannon fire erupted from the tree line. Cossacks struck the flanks. Panic surged along the French column as wagons overturned and horses screamed. Davout's men fought desperately, but they were surrounded. Smoke lifted through bare branches. Muskets cracked in the frost. Wounded soldiers staggered through the snow, slipping on ice stained with blood. Had Eugene and Poniatowski not rushed to help, Davout's corps might have been annihilated. Even so, the French lost thousands, lives that could never be replaced. Homes, stores, and warehouses burned behind them. The Russians pressed closer. Confidence grew in their ranks. The men cheered the victory. They laughed. For the first time since June, the Russians no longer felt cursed. They felt triumphant. The French no longer felt like conquerors. They felt like prey. From this point onward, the retreat descended into something beyond war, something primal, something nightmarish. The army was now less an army and more a disordered river of humanity flowing west, driven by fear and cold and the desperate hope that somewhere, beyond the horizon, safety waited. The sky darkened earlier each day. The wind became a knife. Snow fell harder, sticking to uniforms, clinging to hair, freezing inside boots. Men huddled around pitiful fires, using broken rifles for fuel. Horses died by the thousands. Their bodies became both food and landmarks. Soldiers cut strips of meat from frozen carcasses, thawing them with embers cupped between trembling hands. In the morning, many never woke. Napoleon pushed forward relentlessly. He had no choice. Each hour he delayed meant more dead men, more attacks from Cossacks, more pressure from the tightening jaws of the Russian armies closing around him. But the retreat was not simply a march through cold. It was a march through despair, and the worst trials, the kind that would enter legend, that would haunt survivors for decades, that would freeze itself into European memory, had not yet begun. Ahead lay Krasny. Ahead lay the crossing of the Berezina. Ahead lay the end of the Grande Armée. The retreat had only just begun. The farther the Grande Armée retreated, the more the land itself seemed to turn against them. Forests that once whispered with summer leaves now stood skeletal and bare, their branches clawing at the gray November sky. Streams that once glittered with sunlight now froze into jagged ribbons of ice. Villages that once offered bread and warm stoves now lay burnt and empty. Roofs collapsed, doors smashed, windows shattered, the work of invading soldiers or angry peasants seeking revenge. Marching through these silent ruins felt like marching through a graveyard. As November deepened, the cold sharpened its teeth. The first true winter storm hit with a ferocity none of the veterans expected. Snow whirled in thick sheets, cutting visibility to a few meters. Drifts piled against abandoned wagons. Horses slipped and shattered their legs on ice. Men collapsed mid-step, unable to rise, their limbs stiffening within minutes. The retreating soldiers lost all sense of formation. Regiments dissolved, units mixed together. Officers shouted commands no one heard. Drums froze. Bugles jammed with ice. The mighty Grande Armée became a moving shadow. Tens of thousands of silhouettes staggering through the blizzard. Each man guided less by discipline than by instinct. Keep moving or die. Nightfall made everything worse. When darkness swallowed the column, wolves howled across the white plains. Long, mournful, chilling notes that made even hardened soldiers grip their muskets tighter. The men huddled around small fires that crackled weakly as they burned wood, scraped from wrecked wagons or torn down fences. Some burned furniture looted from Moscow months earlier, beautiful wooden chairs now sacrificed simply to keep a spark alive. But even fire brought little comfort. The flames illuminated the faces of dying men, eyes sunken, lips cracked, skin pale and lifeless. Those who drifted too far from camp never returned. Search parties often found them half buried in snow, their bodies curled as if sleeping. Every morning was a ritual of horror. At dawn, the living shook the dead to see who could still rise. Many who sat around the fire the night before remained exactly where they were, silent, frozen, their bodies stiff as stone. The cold did not kill with violence, it killed with indifference, and yet the Grande Armée marched on. By early November, Napoleon realized that Kutuzov's strategy, avoiding major battles, letting winter do the killing, was working with brutal efficiency. The emperor needed to keep the Russians off balance, to force them back with quick, powerful strikes whenever possible. Otherwise, the retreat would become a massacre. That chance came near the town of Krasny. Napoleon reached the outskirts first. His remaining elite troops, the Imperial Guard, marched at his side, still disciplined, still proud, though their ranks were thinning each day. Behind him lay an endless stream of freezing soldiers, wounded men, children, civilians, deserters, and stragglers. He needed all of them to survive. But Miloradovich was closing in fast. Russian cavalry scouts observed the French column stretch thin across miles. Snow flurries made the air hazy, but the opportunity was obvious. If the Russians could strike hard and fast, they could cut the French into pieces, block Napoleon in the front, annihilate Ney in the rear. Kutuzov hesitated again, but Miloradovich acted. He moved with confidence, placing artillery on the ridges overlooking the road. Cannons roared at sunrise, their thunder echoing across frozen fields as the first wave of shells slammed into the French ranks. Wagons shattered, horses collapsed, men scattered in panic. The retreating army's fragile order dissolved instantly, but Napoleon refused to be trapped. He rode into the storm of cannon fire with the Imperial Guard behind him. Cavalry, grenadiers, voltigeurs, veterans who had survived Italy, Austria, Prussia, Spain. They had marched across Europe for more than a decade and still believed in him, and now, in one of the darkest hours of the campaign, he called upon their loyalty. The Guard marched forward as if they were marching in Paris. Through swirling snow they advanced with perfect precision, lines straight, muskets leveled, bayonets gleaming through fogged air. They fired disciplined volleys that cut through Russian infantry, then advanced again, their breath forming white clouds, their boots crunching on ice and trampled bodies. To the Russians watching, it felt like a nightmare. The Guard seemed unstoppable, almost inhuman in their determination. Later, a Russian partisan officer described it with a metaphor that became legendary. They moved through our Cossacks like a warship cutting through fishing boats. The Russian line wavered. Soldiers fell back. Officers yelled for reinforcements that did not arrive quickly enough. And in a matter of hours, the danger of immediate encirclement was broken. Napoleon had gambled everything and won, but the victory was hollow. Behind the Emperor's triumphant advance, disaster unfolded. Ney's rearguard, 6,000 of the bravest men in the army, had been cut off completely. Isolated, surrounded, pounded by artillery, snowstorm raging, no hope of rescue. For these men, the retreat turned into a crucible. That night, as the Russians closed around them, Ney gathered his officers. His face, once full of fire, was now gaunt, pale, haunted by frost and exhaustion. But his spirit remained unbroken. He refused surrender. He refused defeat. He refused to let his men die without taking fate into their own hands. They formed a desperate plan. At midnight, under the cover of darkness and swirling snow, they attempted the eyewitness. Impossible, crossing the frozen Dnieper River. The ice cracked under their boots. Men fell through black water and vanished beneath slabs of ice. Others used muskets and bayonets to claw their way up the opposite bank. By dawn, only about 1,000 survived. They rejoined Napoleon days later, stumbling into camp like ghosts, their faces burned by frost, their uniforms shredded. When Napoleon saw them, he called Ney the bravest of the brave. But bravery could not stop what was coming. Ahead lay the Berezina River, a crossing that would become one of the most infamous scenes in military history. A place where hope, courage, suffering, and death would collide in a chaos so intense that even survivors struggled to describe it. The Grande Armée was now a broken giant, staggering toward a frozen river that might save it, or swallow it whole. The retreat was entering its darkest hour. The march toward the Berezina was not a journey. It was a slow descent into a nightmare. Every step westward felt heavier than the last, as if the very earth were dragging the men back toward the frozen ruins of Moscow. Snowstorms came in waves, alternating between blinding white walls of wind and eerie silences where the only sound was the crunch of boots on ice or the distant howl of wolves. Napoleon rode in silence, wrapped in layers of fur, his face expressionless. His officers watched him anxiously. Some wondered if he still had a plan. Others wondered if he was simply trying to outrun his own doubts. The Emperor had never been so visibly shaken. He kept a vial of poison hidden in his coat, his final escape if capture became inevitable. Even the greatest conqueror of Europe feared humiliation above death. Behind him, the Grande Armée had lost all semblance of order. Columns that once marched with precision now twisted chaotically across the frozen plains. Soldiers wandered like sleepwalkers, muttering prayers, curses, or incoherent pleas for warmth. The youngest men looked like old ones. The strongest soldiers limped. The weakest fell and vanished beneath new layers of snow. By the second week of November, temperatures plunged to levels few Europeans had ever experienced. 20 degrees Celsius, then 25 degrees Celsius, then lower still. The cold was not weather. It was punishment. It seeped through boots, cracked skin, froze fingers onto rifle stocks. Muskets became impossible to load. Cannons froze solid. Horses collapsed mid-gallop, their bodies stiff within minutes. One night near the Vop River, the cold reached its peak. Italian soldiers, exhausted and starving, tried to cross a shallow stretch of water. The river was dark and silent, but the air around it was deathly cold. Men who slipped into the water froze instantly. Their limbs locked, their hands turned blue. Some died upright, frozen into the riverbank, still gripping each other for support. The survivors called it the Night of Horror, and still Kutuzov's Russians followed. Not too close, not close enough for Napoleon to force a decisive battle, but always present, always pressuring, always waiting for the moment the French finally broke apart completely. Russian strategy had changed from chasing victory to harvesting exhaustion. Behind the regular army rode the Cossacks, swift, ruthless, relentless. They struck like shadows, galloping in at dawn or dusk, killing stragglers, capturing wagons, seizing whatever food or ammunition remained. For men already starving and exhausted, the sound of Cossack horns in the distance was enough to trigger panic. But the worst enemy was not the Cossacks. It was everything: the cold, the hunger, the endless march, the dead left on the road, the living walking beside them, and everywhere, invisible to the French but coordinated with deadly efficiency, were Russia's partisans. Peasant guerrillas, Cossack detachments, irregular fighters. They attacked from forests, ravines, and burning villages. They stole French supplies, sabotaged supply carts, and ambushed isolated units. They captured messages. They killed prisoners. They mutilated wounded men. They torched anything resembling shelter. Napoleon once feared armies. Now he feared shadows. One of the most feared partisans was Captain Alexander Feigner. Fluent in several European languages, he infiltrated French camps disguised as a deserter or a lost officer. No one ever suspected him until it was too late. Survivors claimed he could walk into a French tent, share a fire with unsuspecting officers, joke with them, and then have their entire detachment destroyed the next day. Even Napoleon knew his name. Even the emperor felt hunted. By mid-November, the French reached Smolensk, the city they had captured months earlier in triumph. They expected supplies, shelter, food, anything, but Smolensk had been looted dry. The warehouses intended to save the army were either empty or consumed instantly by the first units to arrive. Soldiers fought each other over sacks of flour. Some devoured raw grain soaked in melted snow. Within days, Smolensk became a madhouse. Napoleon ordered the army to continue marching. Staying there meant death. Once they left Smolensk behind, the road became narrower. Hills and ravines forced the column into tight bottlenecks. Snow piled higher, horses died by the hundreds, leaving wagons stranded. Officers tried to beat discipline into the men, but the army no longer listened. The Grande Armée was now divided into fragments. A few thousand fit soldiers marched in tight formations. Tens of thousands of wounded or starving stragglers followed behind. Thousands more wandered off the road and disappeared forever. Still, Napoleon pressed on. Kutuzov was closing in from the rear. Wittgenstein was pressing down from the north. Chichagov was moving up from the south to cut off the retreat. They were closing a giant trap. One wrong step and the Grande Armée would be crushed between three Russian armies. Napoleon knew the noose was tightening. He rode faster. His guards pushed ahead. The emperor became desperate for speed because speed was all he had left. That desperation culminated at Krasny. The battle had saved Napoleon but cost the guard dearly. In the aftermath, the men realized a terrible truth. They were being hunted, not fought. The Russians no longer wanted to meet them in open battle. They wanted to choke the army slowly. Starvation, exhaustion, frostbite, ambushes, every hour another wound, another tragedy. And now, ahead of the French line, lay the Berezina River. A wide, icy barrier, uncrossable without bridges, patrolled by Russian scouts, flanked by Russian generals closing the trap. If the Grande Armée could not cross the Berezina, it would die on its banks. The staff officers knew it, the soldiers knew it, Napoleon knew it. Every step toward the river felt like walking toward doom. And still, they marched. Snow fell harder, men collapsed faster, horses vanished, face whitened with frost, hands turned black, fires no longer kept men alive through the night. The road became a corridor of corpses, mothers holding frozen children, cavalrymen still clutching sabers, officers slumped over maps, soldiers lying face down in snow, prisoners executed or abandoned. The Grande Armée was no longer an army. It was a procession of ghosts. By late November, Napoleon reached the village where he expected to find a bridge. But the Russians had already burned it. A frozen river lay ahead. 3 Russian armies were converging. Snowstorms raged with unrelenting fury. Stragglers clogged the road behind. The trap was finally closing. But fate had one last twist left. A peasant, an anonymous Russian villager, revealed a secret crossing point at a place called Studienka, a narrow, shallow part of the Berezina, a place where a bridge could be built, where hope could survive, where the Grande Armée might live another day. It was the last chance, the final card, the razor-thin line between salvation and annihilation. Everything now depended on whether Napoleon could cross the Berezina before the Russians sealed the river from all sides. As the freezing wind howled across the white plains, the emperor gave the order. The final struggle for survival had begun. The night before the crossing was one of the coldest of the entire campaign. A cruel wind swept across the plains, slicing through clothing, freezing breath inside men's beards, and turning every exposed patch of skin bright red before it numbed to white. The Grande Armée huddled in silence, watching the dark silhouette of the Berezina River ahead of them, a black, winding serpent covered in patches of drifting ice. Men whispered prayers. Others sharpened bayonets with trembling fingers. A few simply sat in the snow, staring blankly at nothing. No one dared ask what would happen if the Russians arrived first. Everyone already knew. Napoleon's engineers stepped into the freezing water under the cover of darkness. The river burned like fire upon their skin. Sheets of ice slammed into their legs, bruising and cutting them with every passing minute. But they worked without complaint, dragging beams, hammering stakes, lashing ropes to anchors. Some fainted from the cold and were carried away. Others simply slipped beneath the water and disappeared silently, swallowed by the Berezina. Still, the work continued. The emperor watched from a distance, his face lit only by the glow of distant fires. He said nothing. He didn't dare. Every life lost in that river was another reminder that time was running out. By morning, 2 makeshift bridges stood wavering over the water, thin, fragile skeletons of wood and rope, holding the fate of the entire army. The first soldiers crossed at dawn, stepping cautiously across the slick planks as the river roared beneath them. Then someone shouted. Frostbitten faces turned east. Russian scouts appeared on the ridges. Word spread through the French ranks like lightning. They've found us. Panic rippled across the lines. Officers screamed for order. Drummers beat frenzied signals. Women clutched their children. Wounded men tried to stand but collapsed again. Horses reared in terror. Napoleon immediately sent in the Imperial Guard, his last shield, his last hope, the final unbroken core of the Grande Armée. They marched toward the Russians with grim determination. Their uniforms were tattered, their boots wrapped in rags, but their discipline and courage remained unshaken. They fought not for glory now, but for escape, for one more day of breath, of life, of hope. The Russians charged down the slope in dense formations, bayonets lowered, Cossack lances gleaming. Their shouts echoed across the battlefield, but the guard did not move. They waited with cold fury until the enemy was almost upon them. Then, as one, they fired. Smoke burst across the snow. Russian soldiers fell by the dozens. A second volley, then a third. The Russians staggered under the weight of the fire, regrouped, and charged again. The clash erupted into a brutal melee. Bayonets against sabers, musket stocks against frozen fists. Blood steamed on the snow as bodies fell. But the guard held. Napoleon, watching from a hill, whispered to himself, "Just a few more hours. Just a little more time." Behind him, chaos exploded at the bridges. Thousands of stragglers, men, women, children, servants, wounded soldiers, deserters, rushed toward the wooden planks in a desperate stampede. They shoved, clawed, and fought to be first across. Cannonballs crashed into the riverbanks. Musket fire tore through the air. Horses tumbled into the water, dragging their riders down with them. At one point, the weight of bodies caused a section of the bridge to sag dangerously. The beams groaned. Men screamed. Others slipped off the edge and were swept away by the icy current. Those who reached the far bank fell to their knees, kissing the frozen ground, crying with relief or collapsing unconscious. But the masses behind showed no mercy. They climbed over the living, the dead, the dying, anything standing between them and survival. On the eastern bank, the scene became hellish. Russian artillery opened fire directly into the crowd. Explosions hurled bodies into the air. Shrapnel tore through limbs and shattered bones. Yet still they pressed forward. A mother pushed her child ahead, screaming for him to run. An officer tried to pull wounded men to safety. A young drummer boy clung to a horse, sobbing uncontrollably. Many never made it to the bridge. Many froze, starved, or were trampled under the crushing mass of humanity. Still, the French fought to hold the Russians back long enough for the army to escape. Marshal Ney led a charge so furious, so desperate, that even the Russians hesitated. His men fought like demons, swinging muskets like clubs, pushing the enemy back step by step. Hours passed. The riverbank became a mountain of bodies, but the bridges still stood, barely. By nightfall, most of the surviving troops had crossed. Only Victor's rearguard remained, holding the Russian advance at bay. Snow fell heavier. Flames from burning wagons lit the river red. The screams of civilians echoed across the ice. Finally, in the dead of night, the last soldiers reached the far bank. Victor lit the bridge on fire. The flames devoured the planks, spreading quickly. Stragglers still on the far side rushed forward, but the structure collapsed into the freezing water, taking dozens with it. Their cries were swallowed by the storm. By morning, the Berezina crossing was over. The French had escaped, but at an unimaginable cost. Tens of thousands were dead, thousands more taken prisoner. The river was choked with bodies, drifting downstream like silent white specters. Napoleon looked at what remained of his army. It was no longer an army, just a few thousand exhausted, starving, frostbitten survivors. Still, the emperor straightened his coat, mounted his horse, and said quietly, "Forward." He had no choice. Europe awaited his downfall. France awaited his return. And the ghost of the Grande Armée followed him like a shadow. The march to Vilnius would be even worse, but there was no turning back. Snow swallowed the world as the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée left the Berezina behind. The storm howled across the desolate plains like a living creature, clawing at cloaks, ripping at tents, and driving icy crystals into men's eyes until they streamed with tears that froze before they fell. Every breath came out as mist, rising and vanishing as quickly as the armies that once marched proudly across this land. The survivors trudged westward in silence. The wind drowned out their footsteps, erased their tracks almost as soon as they were made. The freezing air gnawed at their lungs. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes in the span of minutes. Many fell asleep while walking, leaning forward, swaying gently, before collapsing face first into the snow, never to rise again. Those who still lived no longer resembled soldiers. Their uniforms hung from their bodies like torn rags. Their boots had disintegrated long ago. Strips of cloth wrapped around their feet did little to keep out the cold. They marched like ghosts, hollow-eyed and stumbling, driven only by instinct and the faint, fading hope of reaching Vilnius. Napoleon rode among them, silent and grim. The emperor who once commanded continents now led a column of shadows. He no longer spoke of victory. He no longer gave grand speeches. His face was pale, his voice quiet. Even his strongest marshals could see that the fire inside him, the fire that had shaken Europe, was flickering. Every few hours the march was interrupted by skirmishes. Cossacks materialized from the forests, their horses snorting clouds into the frozen air. They circled the French column like wolves around a dying herd. They rarely attacked head-on. Instead, they picked off stragglers, scouts, and those too weak to keep pace. A cry would rise from the rear, someone calling for help, but within moments it was drowned by the thunder of hooves and the hiss of snow swept aside. No one dared turn back. They could not save the fallen. They could barely save themselves. As the army approached the outskirts of Vilnius, the smell of death clung to the wind. Bodies lay scattered along the road, some frozen upright, leaning against trees as if resting. Others curled into balls, their faces covered by snow. Others torn apart by wolves or scavenging dogs. The road had become a graveyard, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Yet still they marched. In the distance, the ruined remnants of abandoned villages appeared, houses with caved-in roofs, barns burned to ash, wells frozen solid. The smallest sign of shelter, even a fallen tree or a collapsed shed, drew desperate crowds who fought savagely for a few minutes of warmth. At one point, a group of soldiers stumbled upon a half-burned farmhouse with an intact chimney. Within minutes, the structure was crammed with hundreds of men piling together in a frantic attempt to heat the space. When someone lit a fire, flames surged upward violently, catching the dry beams. In less than an hour, the house collapsed in a roar of sparks, trapping dozens inside. Their screams were muffled by snow as the survivors outside backed away in horror. But the march continued. Napoleon pushed his men onward, knowing the Russians were close behind. Kutuzov's forces were moving slowly, suffering from the same cold, but they were still advancing. Every day the French delayed meant they faced annihilation, not defeat, total erasure. On December 5th, Napoleon made a decision that shocked his marshals. He would leave the army. With the political situation in Paris deteriorating, rumors of coups spreading and foreign coalitions forming, he could no longer afford to remain on the front. He summoned his officers, voice heavy. The army needs a government. France needs an emperor. I will return to Paris and raise another army, continue the march, survive. The marshals saluted, though their eyes revealed the truth: abandonment, fear, resignation. Napoleon stepped into his small sled, wrapped in fur, and disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée to fend for themselves. The men watched in silence as their emperor vanished into the blizzard. Some whispered bitter curses, others wept, a few raised trembling hands in farewell. For the first time since crossing into Russia, the army felt truly alone. The cold grew sharper after his departure, as if the land itself sensed his absence. Stragglers dropped by the dozens with each passing hour. The weakest could walk no farther. The strongest forced themselves onward through sheer stubbornness. Those who reached Vilnius collapsed inside the city walls. But there was little relief to be found. Supplies were scarce, hospitals were overflowing. The streets were filled with frozen bodies, stacked in corners, piled near doors, lining the alleyways. The misery inside the city almost matched what lay outside. Yet Vilnius was a milestone. Those who entered felt, if only faintly, that they had escaped the worst. But the retreat was not over. The journey to the Niemen River remained, another deadly march across fields of ice and snow. Behind them the Russians closed in. Ahead of them, only more suffering awaited. The Grande Armée continued west, smaller each day, like a candle burning low. The mighty force that once thundered across Europe had been reduced to a few thousand staggering survivors. But still, despite everything, the hunger, the cold, the despair, the dead, they walked, because stopping meant death, and even shattered men dream of one more dawn. The road beyond Vilnius stretched into a wasteland of ice and silence. The survivors, those who could still be called that, moved like sleepwalkers drifting through a nightmare that refused to end. Their breath hung in the air as pale clouds. Their footsteps made no sound, swallowed instantly by fresh snow. Even the wind had grown tired of its own screaming. It whispered now, low and cruel, sliding through torn uniforms and gnawing at exposed skin. The retreat had become something beyond human struggle, almost mythic in its suffering. Every kilometer claimed another 100 men. Every frozen hill concealed bodies beneath the drifts like forgotten stones of a collapsing empire. Some walked barefoot, their feet wrapped in grass or pieces of ruined saddles. Others carried wounded comrades for as long as strength allowed, before gently lowering them into the snow, knowing they would never rise again. No one cried anymore. Tears froze too quickly. The burning fire of hope, once fanned by Napoleon's presence, had dwindled to embers. Without him, the column drifted westward with no guiding voice, no vision of glory, only the instinct to keep moving. The marshals, Davout, Ney, Eugene, did what they could, but even they looked like specters, gaunt faces, hollow eyes, walking with the same exhausted stagger as the common soldiers. Russian partisans hovered at the edge of vision. Their silhouettes flickered through the trees. A shot rang out every now and then, echoing briefly before being muffled by snow. No one even turned to look anymore. The army had no strength to defend itself, no cavalry left to screen its movement, no discipline to form ranks. When the Cossacks charged, the column scattered like dry leaves in a winter storm. Some men broke off into small groups, hoping to hide in barns or abandoned huts. Others crawled beneath trees, imagining they would rest for a few minutes, only to slip into an icy sleep that ended quietly, without pain. The road behind the army became a ribbon of frozen bodies stretching for miles. At night the sky burned with eerie northern lights, green, purple, red, shimmering above the dead plains. Soldiers who still had the strength to look up whispered prayers. Some believed it was a sign of God's anger. Others thought it was a celestial funeral torch, lighting the way for the souls of the fallen. Daylight brought no comfort. The cold deepened. Temperatures plunged to levels the French had never imagined possible. Rifle barrels cracked. Wine froze solid. Bread turned into stone. Muskets couldn't fire because flints shattered like glass. Men leaned together in tight clusters while marching, trying to share warmth. But warmth was becoming a memory, as distant as the Paris cafes they once dreamed of returning to. On the road ahead, the wagons groaned beneath the weight of wounded men. Some begged to be left behind. Others clung desperately, terrified of the Cossack lances that prowled just beyond the horizon. Horses dropped one by one, collapsing with a sigh. When they fell, their carcasses were stripped to the bone within minutes, by starving soldiers first, then by dogs, and finally by wolves that followed the army at a distance, waiting for darkness. The smell of death traveled with them now, lingering in the air no matter how cold the wind blew, and still, unbelievably, the Russians pressed on. Kutuzov himself rode cautiously, aware his men were suffering nearly as much as the French. The Russian supply lines stretched thin across the frozen landscape. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Frostbitten fingers made it difficult to load muskets, yet their morale was high. They chased the army that had once seemed unstoppable, forcing it step by step toward the Niemen River. One evening, the French stumbled into a forest where the trees were so densely packed that the wind barely reached the ground. It felt like a blessing. Small fires sprang to life beneath the pines. Men warmed their hands, staring into the flames as if looking into the past, into a world where they were soldiers of. The greatest emperor on earth, not lost souls crawling toward survival. Someone began humming a French marching tune. Others joined in weakly, their voices breaking. For a brief moment, the forest echoed with the ghost of discipline, the memory of unity. But the song died quickly. Their throats were too cold, too raw. The music faded into coughing, then into silence. The next morning, half of them never woke up. When the horizon finally revealed the Niemen River, what remained of the Grande Armée felt a flicker of life. This was the border, the frontier they had crossed with drums, flags, eagles, trumpets, and 600,000 men. Now fewer than 20,000 soldiers remained, followed by tens of thousands of civilians, limping skeletons wrapped in rags. Crossing back into friendly territory should have brought relief. Instead, it brought despair. The riverbanks were lined with corpses, men who had arrived first, only to die waiting for the crossing. The bridges were choked with wagons, horses, and bodies. Russian artillery fire boomed in the distance, growing closer by the hour. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, rallied the rearguard for the final push. His coat was stiff with frost, his beard was white with ice, but his voice still carried authority. He shouted for the soldiers to keep moving, to cross the Niemen, to survive so that France might remember them. They obeyed. Somehow, they obeyed. As the last remnants of the army crossed the river, Ney remained behind, firing the final shots, refusing to surrender. When he eventually reached the far bank, staggering and nearly frozen, he had only a few companions left. He looked back at the white expanse of Russia and whispered bitterly, "No army but this one could survive such a retreat." By December 14th, the nightmare was over. The men who reached the Niemen collapsed in the snow, too weak to celebrate. They didn't cheer, they didn't shout, they simply stared at the land they had escaped. Behind them lay 500,000 dead. Ahead of them lay an uncertain future. The greatest army Europe had ever seen had ceased to exist. Only a handful of survivors remained to tell the tale. When the survivors finally crossed the Niemen River, they did not feel triumph. They did not feel victory. Most did not even feel relief. What they felt was emptiness. A numb silence settled over their minds, a silence deeper than the snow, colder than the wind, heavier than the memory of everything they had lost. Lithuanian villagers watched from afar as the shattered procession limped past. These were not the invincible soldiers who had marched east in June. They looked like beggars, like phantoms drifting between life and death. Some villagers crossed themselves, others whispered old superstitions, convinced they were seeing a cursed host wandering the earth for its sins. The Grande Armée, once the greatest fighting force in history, was now a broken column of frostbitten faces and hollow eyes. Marshal Davout, who had once commanded tens of thousands, marched with barely a handful at his side. His beard was frozen white, his uniform stiff with ice. Marshal Ney, the hero of Krasny and the rearguard's savior, walked on foot, musket in hand, as if he were a common soldier. His boots were torn open, his fingers were blackened, his voice was gone from shouting commands into blizzards. General Eugene, Napoleon's stepson, had aged 10 years and 2 months. His eyes were sunken, and his uniform hung from his shoulders like the clothes of a scarecrow. He rode silently, watching the men around him collapse one by one. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's proud elite, was now only shadows of its former glory. Yet even broken, they marched with tattered dignity, as if determined to carry the final spark of honor back to France. Behind them came the civilians, women, children, merchants, servants, and deserters, who had clung to the army for safety. Some pushed wheelbarrows, some carried infants wrapped in linen stiff with frost, others dragged sacks of belongings that meant nothing anymore. All were silent, all were changed. The Russian frontier behind them was like a giant white wall. No one dared look back for long. The land itself felt hostile, as if it wanted to swallow them entirely. The cold had become a second enemy, more merciless than any army. Many believed it was alive, an invisible predator stalking them steadily. Rumors drifted along the column in broken whispers. Napoleon is dead. No, he escaped. He abandoned us. He went to raise a new army. None of them knew the truth. None of them had the energy to care. Their world had shrunk to a single thought. Keep walking. Even now, as they crossed into friendly territory, there was no food waiting. Supplies had been drained by the long campaign. Villages had nothing to give. Towns were overwhelmed by the flood of starving, frozen men. Hospitals overflowed. Surgeons frantically amputated limbs blackened by frostbite. Priests whispered prayers over those who would not survive the night. Some soldiers reached the towns only to die on the thresholds. Sudden collapse, eyes open, bodies crumpled like broken dolls. The locals stepped around them with quiet reverence, afraid to disturb their final rest. Those who survived long enough to receive bread devoured it like animals, coughing as they swallowed too quickly. Some choked to death, unable to pace themselves after weeks of starvation. Others fought over crumbs, clawing at each other in desperation. The cruelty of the retreat had stripped away layers of civilization, revealing the raw instinct to survive, and little else. Meanwhile, news carried westward faster than the army itself. In Prussia, people whispered that Napoleon's star had finally fallen. In Austria, diplomats wondered whether it was time to break away from the emperor's orbit. In London, newspapers celebrated each rumor of French losses, printing engravings of frozen soldiers on the Russian roads. And in Russia, bells tolled from every cathedral, celebrating what many saw as divine intervention. Europe sensed that something monumental had occurred. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility had died in the snow, but the emperor himself was already racing toward Paris, riding through storms with only a few loyal officers. At inns and relay posts, he kept his hood up, avoiding recognition. He traveled with such speed that even his guards struggled to keep pace. His mind was locked on one thought: preserve the empire. Behind him, the army staggered on. Days passed, snow fell. Wolves circled the column at night. Survivors huddled together, sleeping in clusters so that their body heat might keep them alive until dawn. Each sunrise revealed new corpses half buried by drifting snow. By the time they reached the safer roads of the Duchy of Warsaw, the remnants of the army resembled refugees more than soldiers. Their eagles were gone, their flags lost, their drums silent. They moved without formation, without strength, without pride. But they moved, and that alone was miraculous. At last, on December 14th, the first survivors reached Kovno on the riverbank. Here the retreat was officially over. The Niemen River separated them from the land that had devoured their comrades. Even the hardiest among them paused and stared at the water, some in disbelief, some in grief, some in silent prayer. A young officer with frostbitten hands fell to his knees and kissed the ground. "Home," he whispered, though he knew France was still far away. Another soldier knelt beside him and carved into the snow with trembling fingers. "Russia, never again." Few understood the full meaning at that moment, but history would. Their ordeal, the hunger, the cold, the battles, the massacres, the endless white plains, would echo across Europe for generations. Poets would write of it, painters would capture its misery, historians would argue over its causes, but the men who lived it would never forget, and the world would never be the same. The deeper the remnants of the Grande Armée pushed into Lithuania, the clearer the truth became. Even though Russia was behind them, the shadow of the campaign clung to every man like frost on his coat. It was as if they carried a piece of that haunted land within them, its hunger, its silence, its merciless cold. In the towns they passed, people gathered to watch the procession. Some stared with pity, others with fear, a few with bitterness. These were lands once under Napoleon's influence. Now, his soldiers looked less like conquerors and more like the pale ghosts of an empire collapsing under its own weight. In Vilnius, the townspeople lined the streets, stunned by what they saw. French grenadiers, once symbols of unstoppable power, stumbled through the gates like beggars. Their bearskin hats were gone. Their uniforms hung in tatters. Their boots were bound with rope and cloth. They clutched their muskets like walking sticks. Behind them shuffled Italians from Eugene's corps, hollow-eyed and shivering. A few wore women's shawls scavenged from the ruins of villages. Others limped barefoot on the frozen stones, their feet wrapped in rags soaked with blood. Polish soldiers helped drag the wounded on sleds, speaking softly in their own language, urging their comrades not to fall asleep. They knew sleep could mean death. Swiss survivors marched together in tight groups, leaning on each other like brothers. Their discipline kept them alive more than anything else. The Westphalians, Württembergers, Saxons, those who survived, were unrecognizable. Many of their regiments had ceased to exist entirely. And among them moved children. Young boys and girls who had followed the army from Moscow, clinging to soldiers who had taken pity on them. Some had lost their parents to the fire or to the Cossacks. Others had escaped burned villages and joined the columns simply because the Grande Armée was the only path westward. These children trudged silently through the snow, feet wrapped in cloth, their cheeks pale from frostbite. A few carried small toys, wooden horses, cloth dolls with missing eyes, the last fragments of their old lives. Night after night, the hospitals of Vilnius filled beyond capacity. Surgeons amputated limbs until their hands trembled too much to hold a saw. Blood froze within minutes if it touched the floor. The screams of the wounded echoed through church halls converted into makeshift infirmaries. Priests walked between the rows of straw mattresses, murmuring final prayers. Some men begged to be put out of their misery. Others clutched medals of the Virgin Mary, or tiny portraits of wives and children they would never see again. And yet, even here, on the edge of death, rumors spread like wildfire. The emperor has returned to Paris. He's raising a new army. He will reward those who survive. He has abandoned us. He will avenge us. No one knew what to believe, for as long as Napoleon lived, hope lived with him. Even dying men whispered his name as if it were a charm against despair. But far from Vilnius, Napoleon was already riding toward Paris through storm and blizzard, traveling with such urgency that he rarely slept. Wrapped in a heavy cloak, face hidden, he sped past villages in the dead of night, switching horses at relay stations, pausing only long enough to swallow a cup of wine or warm broth. He said little to his companions, but they could see the truth in his eyes. He was racing not merely to save his empire, but to outrun the collapse. Back in Lithuania, Marshal Murat now commanded what remained of the army. Murat, king, marshal, cavalry hero, looked utterly defeated. His flamboyant plumes were frozen flat against his hat. His embroidered cloak was torn. His face had lost its color. His eyes were sunken. Yet even in misery, he cut a striking figure on the battlefield. When Cossacks circled the army's rear, Murat rallied the cavalry with a shout, sword lifted high, charging into the swirling snow with the remnants of France's horsemen at his back. His courage alone kept the column alive more than once. But courage could not stop hunger. Hunger gnawed at the men like a living thing. They dug through abandoned wagons for crumbs. They chewed on leather straps. They boiled soup made from bones and snow. They cracked ice from puddles in the road and melted it in helmets. Some whispered that certain soldiers had eaten human flesh to survive. No one dared confirm it. The march became a slow death. Every morning, long before sunrise, the army's hornblowers walked the rows of sleeping men and sounded the call to move. But sometimes the sleeping men did not wake. Sometimes entire clusters of soldiers remained sitting around a cold fire, frozen in the positions where they had fallen asleep. Their comrades gently pried muskets from their hands or closed their staring eyes before marching onward. Day after day, the men whispered the same words to each other. Just reach the next village. Just reach the next hill. Just reach the next sunrise. For some, that small promise was enough. For others, it wasn't. By late November, Russian cavalry had all but abandoned large battles. They simply followed, like wolves tracking a dying herd. They struck at night, snatching stragglers. They harassed the flanks. They darted forward to scatter foraging parties. Their presence became a psychological terror, a constant reminder that death was always nearby. One night, as the moon shone cold and pale over the forest, a sentry stepped away from the road to relieve himself. He never returned. His musket was found in the snow the next morning, but no tracks led away, only the faint, unmistakable prints of horses. In those days, the soldiers learned to fear silence more than gunfire. Snowstorms swallowed entire units. Gusts of wind snuffed out fires before they could warm a single hand. The route west was marked by frozen corpses half buried in snowdrifts. French, Italian, Polish, German, each shaped like a sculpture of defeat. Children who had survived Moscow now collapsed on the roadside. Soldiers carried them in their arms for as long as they could, whispering encouragement, but eventually even the strongest were forced to lay the children down beside the road and keep walking. Some buried them beneath shallow piles of snow. Others simply looked away. At last, after days of marching through a wasteland, the stragglers reached Kovno, half alive. Russian guns boomed behind them, but their sound felt distant, unimportant, like thunder from another world. This was the moment they had prayed for, and yet something inside the survivors broke when they finally crossed the Niemen. They had dreamed of joy, of relief, of falling to their knees in gratitude, but instead they felt nothing, only a deep, hollow silence, a silence that would linger in their hearts for the rest of their lives. Few would ever speak of what they saw in Russia. Fewer still could forget. The Grande Armée had entered Russia as the greatest military force Europe had ever produced. It left as a procession of ghosts, and the world, watching from Paris to Vienna to London, felt the earth shift beneath its feet. For Napoleon's star had dimmed. But the story was not over. The emperor would raise new armies, new coalitions would form, new fronts would open. Because the retreat from Moscow was not the end, it was merely the beginning of the downfall. Snow still clung to their uniforms when the survivors re-entered territory once claimed proudly by Napoleon's empire. Yet for many, the familiar villages and well-built homes did not inspire joy. They only sharpened the ache of what had been lost. The people stared at them in stunned silence. Farmers dropped their tools. Women covered their mouths with their shawls. Children hid behind their parents. The men who had once marched east with drums and banners, singing songs of victory, returned unrecognizable. Gaunt shadows with cracked lips, frostbitten noses, and eyes that seemed to look both at the living and the dead. They did not look like soldiers anymore. They looked like the survivors of a world that had collapsed around them. News traveled faster than the army. Stories of disasters, of Moscow burning, of frozen rivers filled with corpses, of entire regiments gone missing. These tales reached France before the men did. But no rumor could prepare the public for the sight of the few who staggered home. In the salons of Paris, nobles whispered behind fans. Is this truly what remains of the Grande Armée? In taverns, men shook their heads, whispering, if Napoleon cannot defeat Russia, what hope is left for us? Even Napoleon's closest allies had trouble hiding their unease. The emperor's aura, once blinding, now flickered. Yet when he arrived in Paris on December 18th, he walked into the Tuileries Palace with his head high, his coat immaculate, boots polished, and his hands clasped behind his back as though nothing had happened. He refused to limp or show exhaustion. No matter how hollow he felt inside, he projected strength. Everyone watched him closely. His generals saluted, but their eyes searched his face for signs of weakness. His ministers bowed, but they exchanged glances, wondering how much of the truth he would reveal. His wife, Marie-Louise, embraced him with shaky arms. She had lived weeks in terror after the false rumor of his death during the Malais coup. Now she clung to him as though afraid he might disappear again. But Napoleon was already slipping away, not physically, but somewhere deeper, in the unseen chambers of his mind. He had left hundreds of thousands of men behind, and their voices followed him like ghosts. That night, in the warmth of his private office, he sat down and read the latest reports. They told of frozen corpses still being found along the routes near Vilnius, of Polish villages overflowing with starving survivors, of Russian Cossacks harassing every French outpost still east of the Niemen, of Prussian units showing signs of betrayal. He set the papers down, his jaw hardened. He sent for his war minister. We begin at once, Napoleon said. A new army, new conscripts, new material. France must not appear weakened. Never. The minister hesitated. Sire, but the population is exhausted. We have bled our youth dry. Napoleon looked up sharply. Then we will bleed again. Better to bleed than to die. And so it began. In the middle of winter, while Europe still trembled at the memory of the Russian disaster, Napoleon ordered the creation of yet another army, the Marie-Louise conscripts, named mockingly after the Empress, since many of them were barely old enough to shave. They came from farms, villages, small towns, 16, 17, 18 years old. Some had never seen a musket before. Others marched proudly, dreaming of glory. They trained in frozen fields, wearing uniforms too large for them, carrying equipment meant for men twice their age. The veterans who had survived Russia watched them with haunted eyes. One old grenadier muttered, "These boys will never survive a real battle." Another said nothing, just turned away, unable to watch. While France raised new soldiers, the rest of Europe awakened from a long sleep. Prussia, humiliated and tightly controlled for years, now saw its chance. Russian agents whispered in the courts of Berlin. French rule looked weak for the first time in a decade. Prussian generals, once afraid to defy Napoleon, now met secretly in shadowed rooms. We will rise, General York whispered, but only when the time is right. Austria watched, cautious but calculating. They were Napoleon's in-laws now, but their loyalty had limits. They sent polite letters expressing sympathy for France's difficult campaign, but stopped short of offering meaningful help. Britain celebrated, for the Russian winner had succeeded where all their coalitions had failed. London newspapers printed cartoons of Napoleon frozen like a statue, or fleeing Moscow on a tiny horse. Crowds cheered in the streets. Yet the British knew something the others did not. Napoleon was not finished. Not yet. Back in Paris, the emperor worked day and night. He summoned map-makers, generals, and supply officers. He studied new artillery designs. He dictated letters at lightning speed. In just a few weeks, his unstoppable energy returned. He reminded everyone why he had risen from a Corsican unknown to the master of Europe. His will was iron, but even iron can crack. He slept less, ate less. He paced the halls long after midnight. Some nights he stopped at the palace windows and stared out at the snow-covered city, seeing not Paris, but the ghostly fields of Russia. His valet once found him gripping the windowsill so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "Sire, are you unwell?" the man asked gently. Napoleon blinked as if waking from a dream. "No," he answered, "only thinking." Yet his thoughts were no longer his alone. The memories of those who had died followed him everywhere. Men who had marched for him, bled for him, frozen for him. Their faces flickered in his mind like shadows cast by a dying fire. He began to speak quietly when he thought he was alone. "Why did it end like this?" Then just as quickly he silenced himself and straightened his coat, as though ashamed of the weakness. In early January 1813, envoys from Prussia arrived with polite words, but their eyes held something else, something Napoleon recognized instantly: defiance. They delivered formal letters filled with meaningless phrases about peace, stability, and mutual respect. But behind each word lay a simple truth: Prussia was preparing for war. Napoleon dismissed the envoys with a smile, but the moment they left the room, he slammed his fist on the table so hard that papers scattered like snowflakes. "They think I am finished," he hissed. He was wrong about many things, but he was right about that. Across Europe, men whispered, "Napoleon is wounded. Napoleon is human after all. Napoleon can be beaten." Countries that once feared him now felt the pull of rebellion like a tide rising beneath their feet. Russia marched west with new armies. Prussia plotted revolt. Austria hesitated but leaned toward betrayal. Britain tightened its coalition. Spain still bled French soldiers dry in a brutal guerrilla war. And France, exhausted from years of conflict, trembled as it prepared once more to send its youth to the front. The world was changing, and Napoleon, standing alone at the edge of his empire, felt the shift as clearly as a storm rising. But he refused, absolutely refused, to accept defeat. For deep inside, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the guilt, beneath the weight of hundreds of thousands of dead, his pride still burned. And a burning pride is a dangerous thing, because it can rebuild nations, or destroy them. Winter loosened its grip on Europe, but the scars of the Russian catastrophe remained fresh. Even as the snows melted, the silence they left behind felt heavier than the cold itself. Though soldiers trained in the fields and craftsmen hammered new weapons in the cities, something intangible had changed, an invisible shift that everyone sensed but no one dared to speak aloud. France was no longer feared the way it once had been, not because Napoleon had lost his brilliance, but because the illusion of his invincibility had shattered. And illusions, once broken, are harder to rebuild than armies. Still, Napoleon pressed on, determined to force the world to forget the disaster of 1812 by replacing it with victories in 1813. He believed that the quickest way to bury a defeat was to triumph again, loudly, decisively, unmistakably. And so he demanded more men, more guns, more horses, more supplies. The workshops of Paris glowed late into the night as blacksmiths beat metal until sparks flew like angry stars. Tailors stitched uniforms for boys barely past childhood. Officers drilled recruits until their shouts echoed across the countryside. But although the emperor could command steel and flesh, he could not command time. France had been at war for nearly 2 decades. Wives, mothers, and fathers watched anxiously as recruiters arrived in villages carrying lists that seemed to grow longer with each passing month. Some families had already given 2 sons, or even 3. Now the state asked for more. A peasant woman, worn from years of hard work and worry, cried out as the officer read her youngest son's name. She clung to him desperately, begging him to hide, to run, to escape. But her son, eager and proud, straightened his shoulders and walked forward. For him, Napoleon was still a symbol of glory, of greatness, of possibility. The Russia campaign meant nothing to him. Only the uniform mattered. The officer nodded approvingly. "France thanks you," he said. But the woman's tears told another story. Far away in Prussia, the winds of rebellion picked up speed. The Prussian people had never forgotten the humiliation of 1806, when Napoleon crushed their armies and occupied their cities. Now, after Russia, the fear that had kept them obedient began to crumble. Secret societies grew bolder. Officers trained their men in private, pretending loyalty while preparing for the moment to strike. In January, a Prussian nobleman slammed his fist on a table during a secret meeting in Berlin. "The French are no longer gods," he said. "They bleed, they freeze, they starve. Now is the time." Across the room, another officer nodded. "But Napoleon still commands armies larger than ours." "Then we shall strike when he is overextended, and we will not strike alone." And quietly, Prussia reached out to Russia, forming the first threads of an alliance that would soon reshape Europe. In Austria, the situation was more delicate. Emperor Francis was Napoleon's father-in-law, bound by both marriage and treaties. But even he sensed the shifting tides. He could feel the tremor of unease in his generals, in his ministers, even in his own palace corridors. Austria was tired of being trapped between loyalty and survival. One of his advisors whispered, "Sire, the French Empire weakens. If we do not choose the right moment, we may be crushed with it." The Austrian emperor did not reply. He simply looked out the window at the gray winter sky. Even he, cautious and diplomatic, understood that Europe was on the verge of a storm unlike any before. Back in Paris, Napoleon tried to ignore the signs. He buried himself in maps, lines, numbers, and plans. His staff struggled to keep pace with him. He dictated orders at such speed that secretaries changed shifts multiple times a day. He micromanaged supply routes, personally reviewed conscription lists, and even inspected artillery carriages himself. But at night, when the palace had grown quiet and only a few lanterns flickered in the corridors, he felt the weight of something darker pressing on him, the knowledge that his enemies no longer trembled at his shadow. One evening, his chief of staff, Berthier, found him alone in the council room. The great map of Europe lay stretched across the table. Napoleon stood over it unmoving, his hand resting on Poland, his gaze fixed on Germany. Berthier cleared his throat softly. "Sire, the new army will be ready soon. The young conscripts are training well." Napoleon didn't look up. "They are children, Berthier," he said quietly. "They will follow you," Berthier replied, as the others did. Napoleon finally lifted his head. His eyes, once sharp enough to unsettle kings, now held a different light, still intense but streaked with exhaustion. "They follow me," he said, "but I do not know if they believe in me." Berthier had no answer. Napoleon exhaled slowly. "Europe thinks I am weakened. They think the Russian winter defeated me." He clenched his fist. "But I will show them that Napoleon is not broken. Not now. Not ever." With renewed determination, he sent out letters across the continent. Diplomatic notes, veiled threats, attempts to control allies, instructions for generals. He believed that if he could strike quickly in spring, before Russia and Prussia united fully, he might turn the tide. But as February approached, reports came in that Russian armies had crossed into Prussian territory, with cheering crowds welcoming them as liberators. In towns like Königsberg, citizens gathered in the streets, waving Russian flags and cursing the French. Prussian officers defected one by one, openly declaring rebellion. Napoleon's anger erupted like a storm. He slammed the report on the table, shouting, "Traitors, every one of them! They swore loyalty to me. They swore loyalty to France." One of his generals spoke carefully. "Sire, they fear you less now." Napoleon turned slowly toward him, his voice low and cold. "They will learn fear again." But deep down, something inside him knew the truth. Fear could be lost forever, and once lost, it rarely returned. The great machine of war began to move once more. Drums echoed through French fields. Soldiers marched toward the Rhine. Cannon wheels rolled across muddy roads. Europe braced itself. The coming battles would be enormous, bigger than any fought before. An entire generation was about to be thrown into fire, and above it all stood Napoleon, preparing to fight a war he could not afford to lose. For this time, he wasn't fighting to expand his empire. He was fighting to keep it alive. Spring crept slowly across Europe, but it brought no warmth to the hearts of the men. Preparing for war. Fields thawed, rivers swelled, and the first green shoots pushed through the earth. But everywhere armies moved like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The roads of France shook beneath the boots of new recruits. Thousands of young men, their faces still soft with youth, marched in long, uneven columns. Their uniforms hung slightly loose, their muskets awkward in their hands. Some tried to imitate the veterans, chin up, chest out, but their steps betrayed uncertainty. Yet among them burned a strange mixture of fear and pride. For all the whispers about defeat in Russia, Napoleon was still the emperor. His name still held power. Many of these boys had grown up hearing stories of Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, the shining victories that once made Europe tremble. They believed they were marching to join those legends. But veterans who limped along the roads knew better. They watched the boys with hollow eyes, remembering nights when they had huddled under torn cloaks on the icy plains near Smolensk. They remembered the howling wind, the frozen screams, the endless white landscape where hope itself seemed to vanish. They remembered watching friends freeze standing upright, their hands still gripping muskets that would never fire again. Whenever one of the boys asked a veteran, "What was Russia like?" the old soldiers said nothing. They simply looked away, as if the question itself hurt. And so, young and old marched together toward a future none could clearly see. Meanwhile, in Prussia, the air vibrated with a different energy, one of awakening. Towns that had once bowed to French authority now buzzed with open defiance. Students patrolled streets wearing black armbands, shouting for liberty. Secret societies became public movements. Blacksmiths worked through the night, forging weapons for a coming revolt. In the city of Breslau, a crowd gathered outside a government building as officers stepped onto the balcony. When General York appeared, the crowd erupted into a roar that shook the rooftops. Down with the French! Long live Prussia! War for our freedom! York raised his hand for silence. When the crowd quieted, he spoke with a steady voice that carried across the square. Prussia will rise, and we shall rise without fear. It was not merely a declaration, it was a spark, and sparks can set entire nations aflame. In the east, the Russian armies marched forward with newfound confidence. After surviving the inferno of 1812, the soldiers believed destiny guided them. They marched through Poland with drums beating and banners flying, welcomed by locals offering bread, salt, and prayers. Russian officers met Prussian commanders secretly, forging an alliance that grew stronger each passing week. Tsar Alexander, riding among his guards, watched with satisfaction as cities surrendered even before his armies arrived. Napoleon has opened the gates, he told his generals. Now we walk through them. His words painted a future where Russia would shape Europe, not France. Austria watched it all with careful eyes. Emperor Francis moved like a man balancing on a tightrope. On one side stood Napoleon, his son-in-law, ruler of the mightiest empire Europe had seen in centuries. On the other stood Russia and Prussia, rising together like a tide too powerful to resist. His advisors pressed him constantly. Sire, France weakens. If we do not choose soon, the decision will be made for us. But the emperor hesitated. Politics was one thing, family another. His daughter, Marie-Louise, wrote letters pleading for stability, for peace, for safety for her husband and son. But Europe no longer cared for family ties. It cared only for power. Back in France, the professional diplomats could feel the old alliances cracking. In Paris, drawing rooms, politicians and nobility whispered nervously as rumors spread. Rumors of Prussian betrayal, of Russian advances, of Austrian hesitation. One minister confided to another, "If the German states rise against us, the Rhine will become a grave." The other man answered quietly, "The grave is already being dug." But Napoleon refused to acknowledge such pessimism. He worked relentlessly, pushing himself harder than ever. He reviewed drill formations, inspected new artillery batteries, personally commanded training exercises. His presence inspired awe, even among those who doubted the future. He moved with the same force that had once conquered continents. Yet there were cracks, subtle but unmistakable. Late at night he paced through the palace halls unable to sleep, his boots echoing on marble floors. Servants whispered that sometimes he muttered names in the darkness, names of generals lost in Russia, of friends who had died, of men who would never return. One night, as he stood alone beside a tall window overlooking the Seine, a gust of wind rattled the glass. He didn't flinch. He kept staring, almost as if expecting someone to appear in the reflection behind him. Berthier found him there, half hidden in the shadows. "Sire," he said softly, "the troops are ready for your inspection." Napoleon nodded but did not move. "Tell me, Berthier," he said quietly, "do you think Europe truly believes I am broken?" Berthier hesitated. "I think Europe believes what it wants to believe," he replied carefully. Napoleon let out a bitter breath. "They forget too quickly." He walked away from the window, shoulders squared once more. "They will remember soon." Spring ripened into early April, and with it came a thunder that echoed across Europe. Armies on both sides began to maneuver for position. Scouts rode at breakneck speed, drums sounded day and night, towns prepared for invasion, bridges were fortified, roads turned to mud under the weight of cannons. War was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable. And as the armies gathered, France rebuilt from the ashes, Russia and Prussia rising like giants, the stage was set for a conflict larger than anything Europe had seen before. The battle for 1813 was coming, and for Napoleon, it would not simply be another campaign, it would be a battle for survival, not just for his empire, but for his place in history. The armies of Europe moved like restless tides, surging across plains, forests, and valleys, until the entire continent felt as if it were trembling under marching boots. Everywhere people watched the horizon with unease. Farmers paused mid-plow, children clutched their mothers' dresses, and traders packed up their goods early as rumors whispered from village to village. Napoleon is raising a new army. Russia and Prussia are marching together. War will cover all of Europe. In Paris, the emperor stood in the center of a vast training ground, surrounded by tens of thousands of recruits. The wind tugged at his gray overcoat. His hat cast a sharp shadow over his eyes as he looked at the columns stretching toward the horizon. Most of these men were teenagers, pale, thin, and barely old enough to shave. Their uniforms were crisp, their muskets polished, but their faces were uncertain. They had not seen the deserts of Egypt or the fields of Austerlitz. They did not know what it meant to march through fire and survive by instinct alone. But when Napoleon rode past them on his white horse, something changed. Heads lifted, backs straightened, eyes sharpened. He spoke without shouting, yet his words carried across the rows like steel through silk. "You have been called to defend France," he said. "You will face many enemies, but remember, bravery is not in age, but in heart. Europe believes you are weak. Show them they are wrong." The young soldiers erupted with cheers, but the seasoned officers exchanged glances. They knew enthusiasm was not enough to replace the hardened veterans lost in Russia. Across Europe, the coalition formed like a storm taking shape. Russia's battle-worn soldiers marched west, singing old folk songs. Prussia's new army swelled with volunteers, students, hunters, farmers, fueled by patriotism and fury, and Austrian courts buzzed with nervous negotiations. Austria would not act hastily. Francis hesitated before choosing a side, but his generals observed the shifting winds carefully. They saw the Russian juggernaut, the Prussian resurgence, and the French desperation. One advisor warned quietly, "If we stand with Napoleon, we stand alone." Another replied, "But if we stand against him, we stand against a lion wounded but still dangerous." Europe held its breath. Meanwhile, deep in the forests of Saxony, Russian scouts and Cossacks scoured the terrain. Their horses splashed through muddy streams, their lances glittering in the weak spring sunlight. Campfires glowed like scattered stars in the night as men whispered of the battles to come. They spoke of revenge, of justice, of the winter that had scarred their homeland. One Cossack captain sharpened his blade beside the fire and murmured, "This year we chase him all the way to Paris." No one doubted him. In Prussia, the king's small court transformed overnight into a forge of resistance. Blacksmiths hammered swords until sparks filled the air like fiery snow. Women melted down their jewelry, donating silver for bullets. University students drilled in the fields with wooden rifles, their professors training beside them. Songs of uprising echoed through taverns. "Oh, Deutschland, awake!" Flags bearing the black and white of Prussia flew proudly from windows that, only a year earlier, had cowered under French authority. Europe was becoming unrecognizable. Back in France, Napoleon stood beside a large campaign map, tracing lines of movement with his finger. His marshals crowded around, Ney, Oudinot, Marmont, Berthier, each carrying the fatigue of years. They listened as he explained his plan. "We strike at Saxony, we break the coalition apart before it fully forms. If we win there, Austria will hesitate. If Austria hesitates, the coalition weakens." He looked each man in the eye. "We must fight like we have never fought before." The marshals nodded, but the air felt heavy. They remembered the burned villages, the frozen bodies, the endless retreat. Some wondered secretly whether France could truly rise again. Still, orders were given. Cannons rattled into position, flags unfurled. The new Grande Armée marched east, across rivers, across mountains, across memories still raw and bleeding. As the French crossed the Rhine, civilians lined the bridges in stunned silence. Some cheered, some cried, some simply stared, knowing all too well that war would soon sweep through their towns once more. Meanwhile, the coalition leaders gathered for a council. Tsar Alexander stood tall, his blue eyes bright with determination. He placed his hand on the map. "We pursue him until he submits or falls." The Prussian commanders agreed. "Peace has no meaning while Napoleon governs," General Blucher growled. "We crush him now, or our children will fight him later." Their resolve hardened like iron. And so, the next chapter unfolded. The French army, vast but young, moved with urgency. Drums beat through rain-soaked forests. Horses slipped on muddy paths. Cannons labored uphill, wheels sinking into soft ground. Night fell often before the columns stopped marching. Fires flickered among the trees. Smoke curled into the cold air as soldiers huddled together, whispering fears they dared not speak aloud in daylight. Yet when dawn came, they marched again. One veteran muttered to a young recruit walking beside him, "You'll learn something soon, boy." "What?" the recruit asked. "That courage doesn't come from the emperor. It comes from surviving the first hour of battle." The recruit swallowed hard. Meanwhile, Napoleon rode ahead of the army, coat flapping, face unreadable. He sensed the shifting of the world around him. He could feel the coalition encircling him like wolves, but he also sensed opportunity, small openings where genius might still prevail. He refused to accept that the story was decided. Not yet. Not while he could still fight. Not while France still followed him. By late April, the edges of the two great armies finally touched. Skirmishes broke out along forest paths and river crossings. Gunshots echoed through the valleys. Both sides tested each other, probing weaknesses, mapping enemy strength. A farmer who lived near one such river crossing later described the scene. "I saw thousands of men appear from the trees as if the forest had come alive. Smoke rose, the ground shook, and the air smelled of powder and fear. War once again was devouring Europe, but this time the stakes were higher than ever before. This time, the fate of an empire and the fate of a legend hung in the balance. The spring of 1813 would ignite flames that could no longer be contained. And as the first great battles drew near, every soldier, every commander, every nation understood one truth. This war would decide whether Napoleon's star would rise again or finally fall forever."